Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I want to talk about The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. So, I read this book back in June and I thought it was incredible. One of my favourite books I've read for a really, really long time. Probably my favourite book I've read in the last 5 years. Probably. So I thought I would make an individual review about it, and I've been meaning to do so ever since I read this back in June. It has now been a little while, but you know, I think it's still relatively fresh in my mind. And yeah, what do I have to say about this book beyond that it was amazing? Before I get into what this book is about, etc., I will say two things. One, I didn't actually read this book physically. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Elle Potter, which I would really recommend. I thought it was a great audiobook, and I feel like the emotional impact of this book is fantastic on audio. I did, however, go and buy myself a physical copy of it, like, the moment I had finished it, because I loved it so much. The second thing I wanted to say is that this video will be a spoiler-free review until probably like the last few minutes. I want to say some stuff about the ending, but I won't do that until the very end of the video, and I will warn you before I go into spoilery territory. Until that point, the video will be spoiler-free. I won't give away any big plot details, though I will talk about, like, the fact that this book spans a long period of time, if that makes sense. Anyway, so The Well of Loneliness is a fantastic, fascinating novel that I really heartily recommend. This was first published in 1928, and it was banned for some time because of the, like, on the surface, properly discussed lesbian content within the book. It is a really interesting and kind of significant book within the history of queer literature. And I knew a sort of reasonable amount about The Well of Loneliness before going into it. I had heard a lot about it. I kind of knew the general premise, and I had been meaning to read it for a number of years. I'd had the audiobook downloaded onto my phone, like, literally for about 2 years. And the reason why I kept putting off reading it is because I had heard that it was a very sad, upsetting book. And, you know, it's called The Well of Loneliness. It sounds like quite a miserable book, doesn't it? But I think it is very worth knowing going into the book that it is not a wallowing sad book. It is an angry sad book. And I think those are two very different kinds of sad. And I think reading a book that is furious in its sadness is a very different experience to reading a book that is just miserable. So I think that's worth knowing about The Well of Loneliness. It is a book that is very angry and a book that is demanding social change, and that is very different from a book that is just sad. So if you have been putting off reading The Well of Loneliness for that reason, do go and read it. Seriously, it's so good. So what is The Well of Loneliness about? So The Well of Loneliness, as I said, is a sort of early 20th century British queer classic. And it is also a Bildungsroman. Roman. It's very much a coming of age story, and we're following the character of Stephen Gordon from when she's in her, from when she's born, in fact, from just before her birth until she's in her 30s, I guess. And we're looking at her life. So to explain the reason why Stephen is called Stephen, before her birth, her parents are convinced that they're going to have a son, and they have been calling their unborn child Stephen to each other. And so when their child is born and is a girl, they still decide to call her Stephen. From her childhood, Stephen is aware that she is not fitting into some of the roles and expectations that have been put upon her. She doesn't want to behave like other girls that she knows, and she doesn't feel the same way as other girls that she knows. And we follow her as she grows up, what her interests are, her sort of first crush on the housemaid who works in the big grand country house that she grows up in, a crush that she doesn't really understand at the time. We follow her love of horse riding and the countryside, and how much she loves Morton House, the house that she grows up in. Stephen is very much in the kind of upper classes, in the gentry, and she has quite a privileged upbringing, but also quite a lonely, solitary upbringing. And it's clear kind of in her teenage years that her father understands that she is not the kind of person that the world expects her to be, and her mother does not understand this at all. Stephen's father realises that Stephen is gay before she realises that, but he finds himself unable to talk to her about it because he doesn't really understand how to. And we follow Stephen, as I said, through her childhood and teenage years, through her first love, her starting to understand that she is attracted to other women, through her experiences as an ambulance driver during the First World War, through various relationships, through her career as a writer. I don't think it's a spoiler to say these things because I feel like these are the things that make this book fantastic, and that make this book interesting, and especially when a book is a bildungsroman, to just say it's about her life. I feel like that doesn't tell you enough. Some of the book takes place in Morton, which is in the kind of rural English countryside, but we also go to London and to Paris and to various other places. And as I said, it is basically the story of Stephen's life, and of the struggles that Stephen faces as a woman who is attracted to other women at a point in time that does not accept that. And there's a lot of really interesting explanation within the novel of both sexuality and gender. Stephen doesn't always feel comfortable within her body, and Stephen refers to herself as an invert, which is a late 19th century, early 20th century term, which has a crossover with homosexual, but it also incorporates some like aspects of being genderqueer, as we might call it today, I suppose. The term invert, as far as I understand it, is not like exactly the same as the term homosexual. It means something slightly different within this point in time. Obviously, it's complicated talking about like how people understood themselves in the past, when different like terminology and ideas were available to people. Anyway, I think the book is very interesting, both in terms of gender and in terms of sexuality. I think it's a fascinating novel in terms of queer history, in terms of social history, in terms of gender history. If you are interested in queer history in any way, you should read this book. Also, if you're interested in bildungsromans and coming of age stories in any way, you should read this book. Also, if you're interested in the First World War, and if you're interested in changing ideas about gender in the run-up to the First World War and after the First World War, you should read this. Also, if you're interested in reading books about novelists, you should read this. If you just like good books, you should read this because it's so good. I love this book for so many reasons. As I said, I think it is a fantastic coming-of-age story, and the psychology of Stephen Gordon is just so completely real. Everything that Stephen does and says and thinks feels so entirely real, and her psychology is so well developed, as is the psychology, I think, of a lot of the other characters around her. I already mentioned her parents, who I think are really interestingly drawn, and lots of the other characters that Stephen meets kind of along her life journey are really interestingly drawn. There's also a wonderful character called Puddle, who is Stephen's governess, who I just absolutely adored. Puddle was probably my favourite character in the book. I mean, actually, Stephen was my favourite character, but Puddle was fantastic, and I really, really liked the way she was drawn. As I said, I found this book kind of historically fascinating, and I think the insights it gives you into social history and life in the late 19th, early 20th century, especially into what it was like to be a writer at this point in time, and especially into certain elements of the First World War. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And as I have already said, this book is very interesting in terms of queer history, both in terms of like the way that Stephen Gordon understands herself, but also the fact that she meets a lot of other queer people in the novel who are queer in lots of different ways, and that's really interesting. And I feel like other queer classics I've read don't have as big a cast of characters who are also queer. And I think the way that Stephen does, and doesn't at times, engage within the queer community around her, especially when she's in Paris in certain parts of the book, I thought that was really interesting. Stephen is a person from the gentry in the late 19th, early 20th century, and has like her prejudices. Like, she is a bit of a snob sometimes, and I think there's a really interesting like conflict within Stephen of wanting to find people who are like her, but also so desperately wanting to be considered normal that she doesn't really always want to be part of a group of people who are actively defining themselves against normal, because she has this longing to kind of be accepted by conventional polite society, which I think is partly bound up with her sort of upper class background, and there's a lot of interesting things kind of around class in the book as well. Stephen is a complicated character. Stephen is not always perfect, and sometimes I was so angry with her, but also like I loved her so much as a person, and I felt for her so much. And one of the things in this book that is just fantastic is the emotional resonance of this book. It is an incredibly hard-hitting book. As I said, a very angry book, more than a sad book, but it is upsetting, and there are points that are deeply unhappy. And I think especially a lot of Stephen's childhood is so lonely, and she's so confused, and she doesn't have the words to understand herself, which I think is just very like, hard to read at points. Like I listen to audiobooks while exercising a lot, and I listen to audiobooks at the gym a lot, and the amount of times I was listening to The Well of Loneliness at the gym being like, I mustn't cry at the gym. That would be weird. When I was listening to The Well of Loneliness, an audiobook at home, I just had a weep, and that was good. But never like a despairing weep, but just a like, oh Stephen, I hope you're okay weep. I also think it's worth saying that although there are a lot of passages of this book that are sad and lonely, there are also several passages in the book that are much happier. It's not all like misery all the way through. I do think that's worth knowing as well. I feel like I've heard people say that about it, and I don't think that's true. But then I'm also someone who doesn't think that Thomas Hardy books are miserable all the way through, so you know, this is less miserable than Thomas Hardy. As I said, I feel like it is a really angry book more than it is a sad book. The author and the novel are so angry at the things the world does to Stephen, and at the lack of consideration the world has for Stephen, and at how certain people treat Stephen. There is so much anger in this book, but also understanding as well. Like, there are certain characters in this book who treat Stephen very badly, who I was harsher on in my mind than the book is. But leaving aside sort of like individual characters and thinking more about sort of the exploration of society and sort of social rules as a whole, the novel is so angry at the lack of acceptance for Stephen and people like Stephen, and there is so much anger and like fury present in this book at how the world treats Stephen, and that stops it being a sad book and makes it an angry, empowering book, I think, because it is filled with a fury and a demand for justice and for understanding, and a demand for tolerance and sympathy. You know, this book is a demand for understanding and also for the right to, you know, live your life as you want to and love whoever you love. And it's fantastic. Something else I loved about this book is the way it's written. In general, I would say I am more of a like plot and character led reader than a writing led reader. Like, I don't always read books and think, wow, the writing is amazing. Usually I'm like, oh, I love that character, or I love that plot, oh, that's a really interesting theme, what a fascinating novel. But I don't usually just sit there and think, what an amazing sentence. But when reading The Well of Loneliness, I did. But never in a way that got in the way of the story and the characterization and what Radcliffe Hall was trying to do, just in a way that was perfect. I loved the way it was written. Radcliffe Hall uses like repetition sometimes, and she also uses like imagined dialogue quite a lot of the time, where characters think about saying things and then don't say them, and that worked really well, partly because it kind of fed into this idea of like how difficult it is to speak about things that are not spoken about often, but also some of those sections were just written so stunningly. I thought the writing was just incredible, and every like sentence and every moment I just loved. Like, there were several bits where I would just like rewind my audiobook by like a minute to listen to a paragraph again. I almost never do that when listening to audiobooks, but I did for The Well of Loneliness. I'm going to read you one paragraph from the book. I did take several screenshots while reading the book, like on Project Gutenberg on my phone, of bits that I wanted to like come back to and bits that I loved. And then I stupidly cleared out my phone like pictures, and I thought I had backed them up and I hadn't, so I deleted those screenshots. But I found one passage again that I had highlighted, so I'll read that out because I thought it was a really like telling passage, which I think sums up a lot of the kind of message of the book. This is a moment where Puddle, Stephen's governess, is thinking about talking to Stephen, but she can't quite bring herself to do it. And this is the moment. She would go to the girl and say, I know all about it. You can trust me, Stephen. And then she would counsel and try to give courage. You're neither unnatural, nor abominable, nor mad. You're as much part of what people call nature as anyone else, only you're unexplained as yet. But someday that will come, and meanwhile don't shrink from yourself, but just face yourself calmly and bravely. And I feel like that is a lot of the message of the book. Although I feel like the message of the book is probably angrier than the calm part, but I feel like Puddle is probably a calmer character than Stephen. But I think that idea of sort of being unexplained is quite an important idea within the novel. And it's partly about being a person who is unexplained, but also partly about being a person who isn't listened to when they try to explain themselves. That's kind of an interesting point within the book as well. So yeah, do I have anything more to say? I feel like I've mostly just gone on quite a long ramble about how amazing this book is, that wasn't very coherent. Should I have planned this review out more? I don't mind. I did kind of want to like just sit down and have a chat about how much I love this book, because I thought it was fantastic. And as I said, genuinely like my favourite book I've read in the last 5 years. I thought this was wonderful, and I will definitely reread it. Maybe physically, maybe on audiobook again next time, but I feel like this is the kind of book I will return to again and again. I loved it so much, and I really, really highly recommend it. And I would really recommend this to everyone, but I would say especially if you're someone who has been thinking about reading this and who has been putting it off because you're worried it's going to be too miserable a book, I will say it is an angry, sad book. And that makes a difference. And I would describe this more as an angry book than as a sad book, if that makes sense. And I thought it was fantastic. That is it for the main part of this video. As I said, I do have a couple of things to say about the ending, so I will, you know, talk about that now. But if you haven't read this book, please don't stay. Go along and read it, because it's great. And now we will move into a few spoilers before I wrap up this video. So yes, I wanted to talk quickly about the ending of The Well of Loneliness, because I found the ending quite interesting, and I had heard that the ending was bad, or that people were unhappy with the ending. So I was kind of not sure what I would think about the ending. And as we got closer and closer to the end, I had various things in my mind that I thought were going to happen. And I actually liked the ending, and the ending wasn't what I was expecting. I'm really hoping that you have read this book if you are still watching, but you know, as you've read it, towards the end of the novel, Stephen has been in a long-term relationship with a woman, Mary, when an old friend of hers, a man called Martin, comes back into their lives. And the moment Martin came back on the scene, I was like, oh God, Stephen is going to leave Mary and marry Martin in order to be conventional, and it's going to be terrible, and I'm going to be really upset by that ending. And then when it seemed that Martin and Mary maybe were attracted to each other, I thought, oh no, Mary's going to leave Stephen for Martin and Stephen's going to commit suicide. It's going to end with that. I think I had heard people say they didn't like the ending, or that they wanted a different ending for the book, and therefore I was expecting one of those two things to happen, which I would have been really upset with. But that's not what happens. What happens is Stephen like pretends to Mary that she's having an affair with someone else in order to make Mary go off with Martin, so that Mary, who is, you know, bisexual, pansexual as we would say today, Mary goes off to live with Martin. And the book kind of ends with a plea for justice and understanding. And now there was only one voice, one demand, her own voice into which those millions had entered. A voice like the awful deep rolling of thunder, a demand like the gathering together of great waters, a terrifying voice that made her ears throb, that made her brain throb, that shook her very entrails until she must stagger and all but fall beneath the appalling burden of sound that strangled her in its will to be uttered. God, she grasped, we believe. We have told you we believe. We have not denied you. Then rise up and defend us. Acknowledge us, O God, before the whole world. Give us also the right to our existence. Like the final line of the book is, give us also the right to our existence. I understand why it is a disappointing ending to some people that Stephen and Mary don't continue together. But I don't think it's a bleak, despairing ending. I think it is an angry, demanding ending. I was expecting something worse to happen at the end because of what I'd heard of it. So I ended up therefore finding the ending like quite powerful. And I also kind of think that the fact that Stephen gives up Mary rather than Mary leaving Stephen is quite significant. Like Stephen makes that choice, and Stephen gets to be the sort of like romantic hero figure. I feel like that matters less to a modern reader, but would have been more impactful in the 1920s. So although I have sort of complicated feelings about the ending in some ways, I was kind of expecting something a lot worse to happen at the end, and I feel like the ending the book has is powerful, that it's not a capitulation. It's not a happy love story ending, but it is an ending in which Stephen is confident and assured in who she is and is demanding recognition from God and from the world. And that's kind of great. So I love The Well of Loneliness a lot. I thought it was so fantastic and so fascinating, and I will be thinking about it for a very long time. So I would really, really recommend The Well of Loneliness. I mean, hopefully if you stay till the end, you've read this already, but you know, I thought it was so great. I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. And yeah, that's all for now. I hope this hasn't been too rambly a review, but thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.